In the frozen hell of the Ardennes, Sergeant Daniel Hawkins was about to lead his men into the fight of their lives. A desperate march through snow-covered wilderness turned deadly when a German battalion encircled them, cutting off all hope of retreat. Hawkins wasn't just another lost American soldier. For a decade, he had served as a reconnaissance expert in the U.S. Army, a master of terrain, survival, and guerrilla warfare. In North Africa, he had ghosted entire enemy patrols. In Italy, he'd orchestrated escapes from behind enemy lines. Now, in the depths of the Battle of the Bulge, he faced his greatest challenge yet. When the Germans launched their ruthless ambush, they had no idea they were walking into the mind of a predator. Hawk studied their tactics, twisted their assumptions against them, and set a trap that would turn the hunters into the hunted. What began as a retreat would become an unrelenting campaign of sabotage and revenge. The Ardennes would never be the same after Hawk and his men proved that the deadliest enemy wasn't the one with the most firepower, but the one who refused to die. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Blood froze before it hit the snow. Sergeant Daniel Hawkins noticed this as he wiped his knife clean on his trousers, watching the crimson droplets crystallize mid-air. 22 degrees below freezing, he reckoned. The kind of cold that killed as efficiently as bullets. "Keep moving," he ordered, his voice barely audible above the wind howling through the Ardennes forest. Behind him, 4 men trudged through knee-deep snow, their shoulders hunched against the merciless December chill. 5 days since they'd seen the sun. 3 days since they'd made contact with command. Corporal Jake Red Miller adjusted the rifle slung across his back, frost forming on his ginger beard with each labored breath. "We've been walking in circles, Hawk." "If we were walking in circles, we'd be warm by now," Private Eddie Slick Santoro muttered, rubbing his hands together as he carried the squad's malfunctioning radio. The New Yorker's cynicism was as reliable as his street smarts. "Face it, we're lost." "We ain't lost," Hawk replied, though uncertainty gnawed at him. The artillery strike had taken out their communications, along with their compass. Since then, he'd been navigating by instinct, using the terrain features he'd memorized from reconnaissance maps. Fallback point should be just beyond that ridge. Private First Class Lewis Ox O'Malley, a mountain of a man carrying twice the gear of anyone else, pushed forward without complaint. Behind him, Private Timothy Brooks, Timmy to everyone, struggled to match the older men's pace. His boyish face pinched with exhaustion and cold. "I don't like this," Red said, scanning the too quiet forest. No birds, no movement. Hawk felt it too, the unnatural stillness. He'd grown up hunting in Montana's wilderness, where silence often preceded danger. But before he could voice his concern, they crested the ridge and saw it, the remains of an American convoy scattered across the valley floor. 3 trucks overturned, bodies half buried in snow, equipment strewn across 100 yards. "Jesus Christ," whispered Ox, the big man crossing himself instinctively. Hawk held up his fist, stopping the squad. Nobody moves. Slick let out a low whistle. "Ambush. Happened maybe 12 hours ago." Hawk studied the scene through his binoculars, noting the precision of the attack. This wasn't random. The convoy had been traveling to the same fallback point they'd been aiming for. Someone knew this route. "We're cut off," Red realized, his voice tightening. "Those are supply trucks from 101st. If they got hit here, then the Germans are between us and any friendly forces." Hawk finished, his mind racing through their diminishing options. The squad moved cautiously down to the wreckage, checking bodies for survivors, though they knew they'd find none. The German attack had been thorough. Timmy, his young face ashen, knelt beside a dead radio man. "His throat's cut. They didn't just ambush them, they finished them." "SS tactics," Hawk said grimly. "Efficient. Sends a message." Red rummaged through one of the overturned trucks, emerging with a map and a handful of ammunition. "Ammo's low, food's gone, but I got something." He spread the map against the truck's side, pointing to markings in red pencil. Looks like command was pulling everyone back to St. Vith. Generals regrouping. That's 30 miles north, Hawk calculated, already knowing they couldn't make it. Not with the Germans clearly controlling the routes. The first bullet struck the truck 6 inches from Red's head, the crack of the rifle echoing across the valley a half-second later. "Cover!" Hawk shouted, dragging Timmy behind the nearest truck. As more shots tore through the air, Ox and Slick dove behind a fallen tree while Red rolled under the vehicle. "Sniper," Red called out. "Northeast ridge, maybe 600 yards." Hawk scanned the tree line, spotting movement, not just one sniper, but multiple positions. This wasn't a random patrol. This was coordinated. "We gotta move," Slick urged. "We're sitting ducks out here." A bullet punched through the truck's thin metal, showering them with sparks. Timmy flinched, his young face contorted with fear. Hawk gripped the kid's shoulder, steadying him. "Look at me," he ordered. "We're not dying today, not like this." He surveyed their surroundings, mind working through terrain features like a chess player seeing 10 moves ahead. The dense forest to their west offered cover. Beyond it, he recalled from the map, stood an old hunting lodge. Defensible. Hidden. "On my signal, we break for the trees," Hawk said. "Short bursts of covering fire, leapfrog pattern. Ox takes point. Red, you bring up the rear." Red's jaw tightened. "We should punch straight north, hit hard, break through." "That's suicide," Hawk countered. "They're not just in front of us, they've got us flanked. I'd bet my life on it." "You are betting our lives," Red shot back. A tense moment passed between them before Red finally nodded. "Your call, Sergeant." Hawk detailed the route, each man committing it to memory. No room for error. "Ready? Now," Hawk signaled, and Ox burst from cover, his massive frame surprisingly agile as he laid down fire. The others followed in practiced sequence, bullets kicking up snow around them as they sprinted for the tree line. They made it to the forest's edge, pushing deeper into the woods as German shouts echoed behind them. The snowfall intensified, a blessing that would cover their tracks but a curse that would slow their progress and potentially bury them alive, if they couldn't find shelter. After 2 miles of arduous travel, the hunting lodge appeared through the whiteout, a sturdy 2-story structure of stone and timber, windows boarded, chimney cold. Hawk motioned for caution as they approached, but the building stood abandoned, its previous occupants long gone. Slick cleared the upper floor while the others secured the ground level. The lodge was sparse but defensible, thick walls, narrow windows, multiple exit points. It would have to do. "No fires," Hawk ordered as they settled in. "They'll spot the smoke." "So we freeze instead of burn," Slick muttered, but set about helping Ox barricade the doors. Hawk stationed Red at an upstairs window with the best rifle they had. The Texan's eye was keen. If anyone approached within 800 yards, he'd spot them. "I don't get it," Timmy said, his voice low as he helped Hawk unpack what little equipment they'd salvaged. "Why didn't they just kill us at the convoy? They had us dead to rights." Before Hawk could answer, a voice crackled through the forest, a loudspeaker, German accented but speaking perfect English. "Attention, American soldiers. You are surrounded. Your position is known to us. There is no escape." The squad froze, exchanging glances. "By now you have discovered your lines of retreat are cut off. You have fought bravely, but continued resistance is futile. Surrender now and you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You have 1 hour to decide." The voice fell silent, leaving only the howl of the wind. "That's bullshit," Slick spat. "Geneva Convention, my ass. You saw what they did to that convoy." Hawk moved to the window, studying the landscape through a crack in the boards. The snow was falling in sheets now, visibility down to 50 yards. "They know we're here," Red called down from his post. "That means they know about the lodge." "No," Hawk said, his mind piecing it together. "They know we're in the area, but not our exact position. That message was a sweep. They're trying to flush us out." He turned to the others. "If they knew we were here, they'd have hit us already." Ox frowned. "So what's the play? We can't stay here forever." "And we can't outrun them," Red added, coming down the stairs. "Even if we break through, There's 30 miles of German-held territory between us and St. Vith. Hawk studied the PO. Map Red had recovered, tracing routes with his finger. They think we'll either surrender or make a run for it. Either way, they're ready. A small smile played at his lips. But they don't know who they're dealing with. And who's that? Slick asked, his tone acid. 5 half-frozen grunts with barely enough ammo to last an hour. No, Hawk replied, his eyes glinting with a dangerous intelligence. Men who are already dead. The others stared at him, confusion written across their faces. Hawk circled the room, gesturing at each man. Think about it. To the Germans, we're just another lost patrol. They expect us to act like one, to run, to surrender, to die. But what if we don't? What if, instead of reacting to them, we make them react to us? He returned to the map, pointing to German positions he'd inferred from the ambush patterns. Their commander's smart, methodical. He's positioned his men to cut off obvious escape routes, conserving forces by using terrain to his advantage. Hawk pointed to a subtle gap in the likely German line. But he's overextended here between these two ridges. Probably thinks the ravine is too steep to cross. For a normal squad, he'd be right. Timmy leaned forward. But we're not normal? No, kid, we're not. Hawk's smile grew harder. We're ghosts, and tonight we're going hunting. As darkness fell, the squad watched from the lodge as German patrols moved through the forest below, searchlights cutting through falling snow. Lieutenant Kruger's voice occasionally echoed across the valley, his offers of mercy now threaded, with warnings of what would happen to those who resisted. Hawk set his men to fortifying the lodge, creating false firing positions, setting up tripwires around the perimeter, preparing escape routes. Every available piece of furniture became part of their defensive strategy. You really think we can survive this? Red asked quietly as they worked. His earlier challenge softened but not forgotten. Hawk met his second-in-command's gaze steadily. I think they expect us to fight like soldiers. He checked the edge on his hunting knife, a personal weapon he trusted more than any army-issued gear. So instead, we'll fight like predators. Outside, the blizzard intensified, nature itself becoming both their enemy and their ally in the long night ahead. As his men prepared for what might be their final stand, Hawk knew the real battle wasn't just against the Germans surrounding them. It was against fear, against hopelessness, against the unforgiving winter, against the firestorm that was coming for them all. Hawk's breath clouded in the frigid air as he finished explaining his plan. The squad huddled close in the lodge's back room, their faces ghostly in the dim light of a covered flashlight. That's insane, Slick whispered, but there was a glimmer of respect in his eyes. You want us to attack them? Not attack, Hawk corrected, his voice low and steady. Hunt. Outside, the blizzard had slackened, the night sky cleared to reveal a bone-white moon illuminating the snow-blanketed forest. Perfect conditions for what Hawk had in mind. Red Ox, you'll set the traps here, here, and here. He indicated points on their crude map where the terrain naturally funneled movement. Nothing fancy. Tripwires, punji pits, whatever you can rig with what we've got. Ox nodded solemnly, already calculating what he could fashion from their limited supplies. Meanwhile, Hawk continued, Slick, Timmy, and I create false trails leading in 3 different directions. He drew lines in the dirt floor. We make them think we've scattered, that we're running scared. And we're not? Timmy asked, his young face tight with anxiety. Hawk gripped the kid's shoulder. Fear keeps you alive. Panic gets you killed. Big difference. Red studied the plan with narrowed eyes. And after we set the traps? We converge here. Hawk pointed to a rocky outcropping overlooking a narrow pass. According to the map, it's the most direct route their patrols would take from their main position. We hit them hard, take what we need, and disappear. What about their commander? Red asked. This Lieutenant Kruger? Hawk's expression hardened. From what we've seen, he's good, methodical, expects us to be predictable. A small, predatory smile touched his lips. So we'll be anything but. The squad broke into their assigned teams, gathering what meager supplies they could repurpose. Hawk watched them work, noting the tremor in Timmy's hands, the tight line of Red's jaw, the weariness in Ox's powerful shoulders. They weren't just fighting Germans. They were battling exhaustion, cold, and the creeping certainty of doom. "Remember," Hawk said as they prepared to move out, "we're already dead men to command. That makes us ghosts." He checked his knife. "And ghosts can haunt whoever they damn well please." Lieutenant Heinrich Kruger stood perfectly still despite the cold, his breath carefully controlled as he listened to his patrol leader's report. "The Americans have gone silent, Herr Lieutenant. No sign of movement since your last announcement." Kruger nodded, studying the map spread before him. Indies, the command tent. Lanterns cast long shadows across the faces of his officers. Outside, his men, a mixed battalion of Wehrmacht infantry and SS shock troops, maintained their cordon around the suspected American position. "They will not surrender," he said finally, his English-educated accent precise. "Not this group." "With respect, Herr Lieutenant," his second-in-command interjected, "they are 5 men possibly wounded with limited ammunition. How much resistance can they offer?" Kruger smiled thinly. "Do not make the mistake of underestimating desperate men, Meyer, especially Americans." He traced the terrain features on the map. "They have a leader, someone capable. The precision of their retreat from the convoy ambush site tells me this." He straightened, decision made. "Double the patrols, 4 men per unit, not 2, and tell the men, these Americans are not to be taken lightly." Red and Ox moved like shadows through the forest, the big man surprisingly silent for his size. They worked with practiced efficiency, setting crude but effective traps along likely patrol routes. "Hawk's gambling with our lives," Red muttered, as he rigged a tripwire to a fragmentation grenade. "Their last one. If this goes wrong..." Ox finished concealing a pit trap with pine branches. "When has Hawk ever been wrong about the enemy?" "There's always a first time," Red replied, but his hands never stopped working. Whatever his doubts, he executed Hawk's plan with precision. Half a mile away, Hawk led Slick and Timmy through their own preparations. They laid false trails, deliberately breaking branches and leaving obvious boot prints, all leading away from their actual planned route. "You really think they'll fall for this?" Slick asked, his Brooklyn skepticism cutting through the night air. "They'll be cautious," Hawk answered. "But they'll follow procedure. Patrols will investigate all signs of movement." Timmy, who'd been silent through most of the operation, finally spoke. "What happens when they find the lodge empty?" "That's the beauty of it, kid," Hawk replied. "By then, we'll have already drawn first blood." 2 hours later, the squad reassembled. At the rocky outcropping, below them stretched a narrow ravine, a natural corridor any German patrol would likely use. "Traps are set," Red reported. "Used everything we had." "Good," Hawk said, checking his watch. "Their patrols change every 4 hours. Next rotation should be moving out soon." They settled into position, each man finding what cover he could among the rocks. The cold was bone deep now, the kind that made trigger fingers numb and thoughts sluggish. Hawk kept his men moving, checking positions, reviewing signals, anything to keep blood flowing. "Movement," Red whispered suddenly, his keen eyes picking out shapes in the darkness below. 4. No. 6 of them. Hawk raised his binoculars. A German patrol moved cautiously through the ravine, their breath clouding in the moonlight. At their center walked an officer, his hands gesturing as he directed his men. "Patrol leader," Hawk murmured. Taking point himself. He studied the man's insignia. Oberleutnant. Experienced. The Germans moved with disciplined caution, checking each step, maintaining proper intervals. These weren't green troops. They were veterans. "On my signal," Hawk breathed, readying his rifle. "Red, take the officer. Ox, the rear guard. Slick, Timmy, the flankers. I'll take point man. 5 Americans against 6 Germans. Hardly fair odds, but the element of surprise would even things." Hawk waited, counting the patrol steps, judging distance and timing with a hunter's patience. Now. 5 rifles cracked in the night air. Below, 4 Germans dropped immediately, precision shots finding their marks with deadly accuracy. The remaining 2 scrambled for cover. "Reload," Hawk ordered, already working his bolt. He tracked the officer who'd somehow survived Red's shot and now pressed himself against the ravine wall, returning fire with a pistol. Red cursed. "Winged him. He's quick." The 6th German, a radio operator, was shouting into his handset, calling for reinforcements. Ox's massive rifle boomed and the man crumpled mid-sentence. "Officer's mine," Hawk said, slipping away from their position. "Keep him pinned." While his squad maintained suppressing fire, Hawk circled through the rocks, using the terrain to approach the wounded officer from behind. The German was good. He'd created a defensible position and was carefully conserving ammunition, firing only when he had a clear target. But he didn't notice Hawk's approach until it was too late. The sergeant's hand clamped over the officer's mouth, knife driving upward between ribs with practiced efficiency. The German stiffened, then went limp. "Clear!" Hawk called, and his men quickly joined him in the ravine. "Jesus, that was close," Slick muttered, eyeing the dead Germans with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Search them," Hawk ordered. "Ammunition, rations, maps, papers, anything useful. We've got 2 minutes before reinforcements arrive." The squad worked quickly. Red recovered 3 Luger pistols and ammunition. Ox found ration packs and medical supplies. Slick scavenged a functional radio, while Timmy stood frozen, staring at the body of a young German he'd shot through the throat. "First kill?" Hawk asked quietly, kneeling beside the boy. Timmy nodded, his face pale. "He looks my age." "Probably is." Hawk didn't offer false comfort. "Remember his face. Remember why we're fighting. Then keep moving." Hawk searched the officer's body last, finding what he'd hoped for, a map with marked positions and a small notebook. He pocketed both as distant shouts echoed through the forest. "Time to go," he announced. "Back to the rendezvous point. Move." They'd barely cleared the ravine when the German response arrived. A full squad, moving with aggressive purpose. But Hawk had anticipated this, leading his men along a pre-planned route that brought them to their first trap. From concealed positions, they watched as Germans triggered the tripwire. The explosion tore through the night, followed by screams and chaos. "That'll slow them down," Red remarked grimly. Hawk nodded. "Let's make them chase ghosts." For the next 2 hours, they executed Hawk's strategy to perfection, triggering traps remotely, firing from multiple positions, creating the illusion of a larger force. The German pursuit fragmented as commanders tried to respond to threats from seemingly all directions. Hawk led his men in a wide circle back toward the hunting lodge, intending to gather their remaining supplies before disappearing deeper into the forest. But as they approached, a glow on the horizon confirmed his worst fear. "They've torched it," Ox growled, watching flames engulf their temporary sanctuary. "Son of a bitch," Slick hissed, his breath clouding in the frigid air. Through his binoculars, Hawk observed the German positions around the burning lodge. Something about their deployment troubled him. They weren't surrounding the building as expected. Instead, they were positioned in a loose semicircle facing outward. "They knew we wouldn't be there," Hawk realized. "They're not trying to flush us out, they're setting a trap." Red finished, understanding dawning on his face. Hawk nodded, grimly. "They're using the fire to draw us in. Probably hope we left supplies or equipment we'd try to recover." "Smart," Slick admitted grudgingly. "What's the play now, Hawk?" Before Hawk could answer, German soldiers emerged from the tree line less than 50 yards away. Another patrol, one they hadn't accounted for. Both groups froze in mutual surprise. "Run!" Hawk shouted as gunfire erupted. The squad scattered, using darkness and terrain to their advantage. Hawk and Timmy sprinted east while Red, Ox, and Slick broke west. Prearranged separation, just as they'd drilled. Bullets whined through the trees around them as Hawk pulled Timmy down a steep embankment, sliding through snow into a shallow creek bed. They splashed through icy water, using the natural depression as cover. "What about the others?" Timmy gasped, struggling to keep pace. "They know where to go," Hawk replied, though uncertainty gnawed at him. The plan had accounted for separation, but not this soon, not this chaotically. After 15 minutes of hard running, they paused to catch their breath. No sounds of pursuit. They'd lost their trackers for now. "You hit?" Hawk asked, checking Timmy for wounds. "No," the boy replied, though his uniform was soaked from the creek and already stiffening with ice. "But I can't feel my feet." Hawk nodded grimly. Wet clothes in these temperatures meant frostbite was a more immediate threat than bullets. "We need to find shelter. Get you dry." "What about the rendezvous?" Timmy asked through chattering teeth. "First light," Hawk said, studying the stars to confirm their position. 3 miles northeast of the lodge. Red will get the others there. He hoped his confidence sounded genuine. In truth, the night's operations had revealed just how dire their situation was. The Germans weren't merely numerous, they were well led, adapting quickly to Hawk's tactics. "Come on," he said, helping Timmy to his feet. 2 miles east, there's an old woodcutter's hut marked on the map. We'll hole up there till dawn." As they trudged through deepening snow, Hawk replayed the night's events in his mind. They'd struck successfully, claimed valuable supplies, and sowed confusion in the enemy ranks. But the cost was high. They were now separated, without their planned fallback position, and facing an enemy who was rapidly adjusting to their tactics. And somewhere out there, Lieutenant Kruger was analyzing every move, learning, planning. Hawk could almost feel the German commander's calculating presence, a mirror image of his own strategic mind. The burning lodge behind them cast an orange glow against the night sky, a beacon warning of harder battles to come. Lieutenant Kruger stood before the blazing hunting lodge, impervious to the cold, his sharp features illuminated by the flames. He held a blood-stained notebook, recovered from the body of his patrol leader in the ravine. "They took his map," his aide reported, "and his pistol." Kruger nodded absently, thumbing. "He looks my age. Probably is." Hawk didn't offer false comfort. "Remember his face. Remember why we're fighting. Then keep moving." Hawk searched the officer's body last, finding what he'd hoped for, a map with marked positions and a small notebook. He pocketed both as distant shouts echoed through the forest. "Time to go," he announced. "Back to the rendezvous point. Move." They'd barely cleared the ravine when the German response arrived, a full squad, moving with aggressive purpose. But Hawk had anticipated this, leading his men along a pre-planned route that brought them to their first trap. From concealed positions, they watched as Germans triggered the tripwire. The explosion tore through the night, followed by screams and chaos. "That'll slow them down," Red remarked grimly. Hawk nodded. "Let's make them chase ghosts." For the next 2 hours, they executed Hawk's strategy to perfection, triggering traps remotely, firing from multiple positions, creating the illusion of a larger force. The German pursuit fragmented as commanders tried to respond to threats from seemingly all directions. Hawk led his men in a wide circle back toward the hunting lodge, intending to gather their remaining supplies before disappearing deeper into the forest. But as they approached, a glow on the horizon confirmed his worst fear. "They've torched it," Hawk growled, watching flames engulf their temporary sanctuary. "Son of a bitch," Slick hissed, his breath clouding in the frigid air. Through his binoculars, Hawk observed the German positions around the burning lodge. Something about their deployment troubled him. They weren't surrounding the building as expected. Instead, they were positioned in a loose semicircle facing outward. "They knew we wouldn't be there," Hawk realized. "They're not trying to flush us out, they're setting a trap," Red finished, understanding dawning on his face. Hawk nodded, grimly. "They're using the fire to draw us in. Probably hope we left supplies or equipment we'd try to recover." "Smart," Slick admitted grudgingly. "What's the play now, Hawk?" Before Hawk could answer, German soldiers emerged from the tree line less than 50 yards away. Another patrol, one they hadn't accounted for. Both groups froze in mutual surprise. "Run!" Hawk shouted as gunfire erupted. The squad scattered, using darkness and terrain to their advantage. Hawk and Timmy sprinted east while Red, Ox, and Slick broke west. Prearranged separation, just as they drilled. Bullets whined through the trees around them as Hawk pulled Timmy down a steep embankment, sliding through snow into a shallow creek bed. They splashed through icy water using the natural depression as cover. "What about the others?" Timmy gasped, struggling to keep pace. "They know where to go," Hawk replied, though uncertainty gnawed at him. The plan had accounted for separation, but not this soon, not this chaotically. After 15 minutes of hard running, they paused to catch their breath. No sounds of pursuit. They'd lost their trackers for now. "You hit?" Hawk asked, checking Timmy for wounds. "No," the boy replied, though his uniform was soaked from the creek and already stiffening with ice. "But I can't feel my feet." Hawk nodded grimly. Wet clothes in these temperatures meant frostbite was a more immediate threat than bullets. "We need to find shelter, get you dry." "What about the rendezvous?" Timmy asked through chattering teeth. "First light," Hawk said, studying the stars to confirm their position. 3 miles northeast of the lodge. Red will get the others there. He hoped his confidence sounded genuine. In truth, the night's operations had revealed just how dire their situation was. The Germans weren't merely numerous, they were well led, adapting quickly to Hawk's tactics. "Come on," he said, helping Timmy to his feet. 2 miles east, there's an old woodcutter's hut marked on the map. We'll hole up there till dawn. As they trudged through deepening snow, Hawk replayed the night's events in his mind. They'd struck successfully, claimed valuable supplies, and sowed confusion in the enemy ranks. But the cost was high. They were now separated, without their planned fallback position, and facing an enemy who was rapidly adjusting to their tactics. And somewhere out there, Lieutenant Kruger was analyzing every move, learning, planning. Hawk could almost feel the German commander's calculating presence, a mirror image of his own strategic mind. The burning lodge behind them cast an orange glow against the night sky, a beacon warning of harder battles to come. Lieutenant Kruger stood before the blazing hunting lodge, impervious to the cold, his sharp features illuminated by the flames. He held a blood-stained notebook, recovered from the body of his patrol leader in the ravine. "They took his map," his aide reported, "and his pistol." Kruger nodded absently, thumbing. "Communications," Hawk said, already formulating their next move. Red pointed to the eastern section of the map. "There's a farmhouse here, about 4 miles from our position." "Too obvious," Hawk disagreed. "They'll check all structures." His finger traced a contour line. "Here, this ridgeline has caves marked. Natural shelter, multiple escape routes. Excellent vantage point." They reached the caves by midday, navigating around German patrols. Inside the largest cave, they established a makeshift base. Hawk and Slick focused on the radio, carefully tuning to the primary German frequency. German voices crackled through the static, Slick translating in hushed tones. "Patrol updates. Nothing significant. Wait, they're changing frequencies." Slick adjusted the dial. A different voice came through, sharper, more authoritative. "That's Kruger," Slick whispered. "He's ordering all units to converge on Sector 4, the area around the hunting lodge. He believes we're still hiding nearby." A slow smile spread across his face. "They found one of our false trails. They think we're heading west toward the American lines." "Perfect," Hawk murmured. The German commander was good, but working with incomplete information. "Keep monitoring. I want to know every movement." For the next hour, they listened as Kruger directed his forces, shifting patrols westward, thinning his eastern flank just as Hawk had hoped. "He's making a mistake," Red observed. "No," Hawk corrected. "He's making a rational decision based on what he knows. Our job is to make sure what he knows is wrong." "We feed him false information," Slick said, understanding. Dawning. Hawk nodded. "If they're expecting us to head west, then we give them confirmation." He outlined his plan, using the German radio to transmit false sightings of American troops, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. If executed properly, they could draw the German forces further away, potentially creating an escape corridor. "That's brilliant," Timmy said, showing genuine enthusiasm for the first time since the ambush. Ox looked troubled. "Isn't that against regulations? Using enemy equipment to transmit false reports?" "The regulation book doesn't cover being surrounded 50 miles behind enemy lines," Hawk replied. "Right now, survival is our only standing order." They set to work immediately. Slick made the transmissions, carefully crafting messages reporting American troop sightings to the west, using proper authentication codes to avoid suspicion. "Keep it believable," Hawk instructed. "Small groups, moving cautiously." Slick began transmitting, his accent flawless as he reported a fictional sighting of American soldiers 2 miles west of their actual position. The response was immediate. Kruger himself acknowledged the report and ordered units to converge on the location. "It's working," Red said incredulously. "They're buying it." By nightfall, the German presence near their cave had thinned considerably. Hawk's plan was working better than hoped. "We've bought ourselves time," Hawk told his men as they gathered around a small, smokeless fire deep in the cave. "Tomorrow, we start planning our move east." The squad's mood improved markedly. For the first time since being cut off, they had seized the initiative. Their victory was short-lived. Shortly after midnight, the radio crackled to life. As Slick listened, the color drained from his face. "Hawk, you need to hear this." A new voice came through the speaker, cultured, precise English with the barest hint of a German accent. "Attention, American soldiers of the Lost Patrol. This is Lieutenant Heinrich Kruger. I commend your resourcefulness in evading my men, thus far." The squad froze. How had Kruger known they were monitoring this frequency? "Your attempts at deception were admirable," Kruger continued. "The false sightings were quite convincing. Unfortunately for you, we captured one of your reconnaissance teams near St. Vith yesterday. They were most informative about American radio protocols." Hawk's mind raced. Kruger was bluffing. There had been no American recon team. This was psychological warfare. "To demonstrate my sincerity, I have arranged a brief conversation for you to hear." New voices came through, American, frightened, pleading. "Name and rank, soldier," Kruger's voice commanded. "Private First Class Michael Collins, 101st Airborne." A shaking voice responded. "And your companion?" "Corporal James Wilson, also 101st. A second American voice answered. "Tell them what happens to soldiers who refuse to cooperate, Private Collins." They shot Sergeant Reynolds when he wouldn't tell them about the supply routes." Hawk analyzed every word, every inflection. The voices sounded genuine, the details specific enough to be credible. "Thank you, Private," Kruger said, then addressing the radio again. "To the American sergeant, leading the patrol in the Ardennes. I know you are listening. I know you have been manipulating our communications. And while I respect your tactical acumen, I cannot allow it to continue." A gunshot cracked through the radio speaker, followed by a scream and desperate pleading from the second American voice. "That was Private Collins," Kruger stated calmly. "Corporal Wilson will join him shortly, unless you identify your position and surrender within the next hour." Another shot rang out, followed by silence. "1 hour," Kruger repeated. "The lives of any other captured Americans will depend on your decision." The transmission ended, leaving the cave filled with horrified silence. Ox lurched outside, the sounds of retching carrying back. Timmy sat frozen, ashen-faced. Red and Slick exchanged grim looks. "He's bluffing," Hawk said finally. "There's no way he captured a recon team. The closest American units are at least 30 miles from here." "Those voices sounded real," Slick argued. "Information anyone could know," Hawk countered. "Basic intelligence. The executions were staged." "And if they weren't?" Red challenged. "If he really does have American prisoners?" The question hung in the air like a grenade with its pin pulled. "We can't surrender," Hawk said. "You saw what they did to that convoy. Kruger's offering mercy he has no intention of delivering." "So we just let them die?" Timmy asked, his voice cracking. "They're already dead," Hawk replied bluntly. "Or, they never existed in the first place." Ox returned, his face pale but composed. For the first time, Hawk saw genuine fear in his eyes. "What if it was one of us?" Ox asked quietly. "What if they had Red or Timmy? Would you still say we can't surrender?" Before Hawk could respond, Slick let out a bitter laugh. "Jesus, Ox, you still don't get it? We're expendable, all of us. Command wrote us off the minute we got separated." "That's not true," Timmy protested weakly. "Isn't it?" Slick turned on him. "We've been following Hawk's crazy plans, risking our necks for what? So we can die slowly instead of quickly." Red stepped between them. "Stow it, Slick, this isn't helping." "No? Then tell me what is helping," Slick retorted, voice rising. "Hawk's little games? Playing cat and mouse until we're too exhausted to keep running?" "We've survived this long because of Hawk," Red shot back. "We're prolonging the inevitable," Slick shouted. "You know it, I know it, hell, even Hawk knows it." Hawk let them argue, understanding the outburst for what it was. Fear finding its voice. Kruger's psychological tactic was working perfectly, fracturing their unity. "Enough," he said finally. "Kruger wants exactly this, us divided, panicking, making mistakes." He faced each man. "There are no American prisoners. That was theater meant to break us, and I won't surrender 5 live soldiers on the chance of saving 2 dead ones." A heavy silence fell. Then Red nodded. "So what's the play?" "We use his expectations against him," Hawk decided. "He thinks we've been trying to escape west. Now we convince him we're moving north instead." "More false radio transmissions?" Ox asked skeptically. Hawk shook his head. "He's wise to that now. We need something more convincing." He turned to Slick. "Can you make the radio transmit on American frequencies?" "Sure, but wait, you want to send messages as if they're coming from American forces?" "Exactly. We create a fictional relief force, supposedly moving south to extract us." "It's crazy," Red said finally, "but it might work." They set to work composing messages that would appear to be American communications, carefully worded to suggest a rescue operation without explicitly saying so. As they prepared the first transmission, Timmy approached Hawk privately. "Are we just delaying the inevitable?" he asked, echoing Slick's accusation. The boy's eyes were haunted, the last vestiges of his youth slipping away. Hawk considered the question carefully. "Maybe," he admitted. "The odds are against us, but inevitable isn't the same as imminent. Every hour we survive is another hour the war continues elsewhere. Another hour for the tide to turn. Another hour for a real rescue to become possible." It wasn't much comfort, but it was the truth. And in a war where lies had become weapons, truth was perhaps the only solid ground they had left. Lieutenant Kruger stood in the doorway of his command post, watching dawn break over the snow-covered forest. His communications officer approached, with a fresh report. "Sir, we've intercepted American radio traffic. They appear to be coordinating a rescue operation from the north." Kruger read the transcripts carefully. The messages were precise, using proper codes and protocols. Quite elaborate, he mused. The sergeant is becoming more creative. "Sir?" the officer questioned, confusion evident. "These are false communications, Miller, designed to make us believe American forces are approaching from the north. Our elusive sergeant is attempting to divide our attention, create an escape route." "How can you be certain, Herr Lieutenant?" "Because I would do exactly the same in his position." He turned to face his subordinate. "The executions I staged affected them deeply. They're desperate now, taking greater risks." He studied the marked positions of his forces. "Maintain our western defensive line, but shift 2 squads north. Make it visible, obvious." "We're playing along with their deception?" Mueller asked incredulously. "For now," Kruger confirmed. "Let them believe we've taken the bait. It will embolden them to move, to expose themselves. Meanwhile, position our best trackers here, here, and here. When they break cover, we'll be waiting. As Müller left, Kruger gazed out at the vast, snow-covered battlefield. Somewhere out there, a worthy opponent was fighting not just for survival, but for the morale of his men. "Show me your next move, Sergeant," he murmured. "The game grows interesting." Back in the cave, Hawk monitored the German responses to their fictional relief force. Just as he'd hoped, Kruger had repositioned troops northward, creating a potential opening to the east. "It's working," Ox said, newfound hope in his voice. But Hawk's expression remained troubled. The repositioning had been too quick, too obvious, almost as if Kruger wanted them to see it. "He's playing us," Hawk realized, "letting us think we've fooled him." Red frowned. "You think he knows our transmissions are fake?" "I'm certain of it," Hawk replied. "Which means he's expecting us to move east now, through what looks like a gap in his lines." The implications settled over the squad. Their deception had been anticipated, countered with a more subtle deception. "So what do we do?" Timmy asked. Strain etched on his young face. Hawk considered their dwindling options. Kruger expected them to head east, likely had troops positioned to intercept them. The western route remained heavily guarded. North and south offered no better prospects. They were trapped in a strategic stalemate, each side anticipating the other's moves. But while Kruger had time and resources, Hawk's squad had only their wits and rapidly fading strength. "We do what he doesn't expect," Hawk said finally. "We split up." The words landed like a physical blow. Throughout their ordeal, the squad had remained together. The prospect of separation struck at their most primal fear, dying alone in this frozen wasteland. "That's suicide," Red objected immediately. "It's our best chance," Hawk countered. 5 men moving together leave an obvious trail. 2 smaller groups can move faster, harder to track. He outlined his plan. He and Timmy would create a visible diversion, drawing Kruger's attention while Red, Ox, and Slick slipped through the eastern corridor. They would rendezvous at a designated point 10 miles away, closer to American lines. "We move at dusk," Hawk decided. "Rest while you can." As the others sought what comfort they could find, Hawk stepped outside. The Ardennes stretched before him, a frozen kingdom of white and gray. Somewhere out there, Kruger was planning his next move, confident in his superior position. But Hawk had one advantage the German commander couldn't match: the desperate courage of men with nothing left to lose. In this psychological war, that might prove the decisive factor. The fractures in his squad's cohesion worried him more than Kruger's forces. Fear and doubt were more dangerous enemies than any German patrol. As they prepared to separate, those internal enemies would only grow stronger. Hawk's jaw tightened as he stared into the gathering dusk. He had led his men this far through hell. He would not lose them now. Not to bullets, not to cold, and certainly not to despair. The psychological war was far from over. The third day of separation dawned with biting, crystalline cold that turned breath to ice. Hawk and Timmy had been moving steadily east, creating a deliberate trail for the Germans to follow while Red, Ox, and Slick hopefully slipped through Kruger's lines to the southeast. Hawk checked his watch. 0700. By now, Red should have led the others to the abandoned mill they designated as their rendezvous point, if everything had gone according to plan. "We should have heard something by now," Timmy murmured, his voice rough from dehydration. Hawk remained silent, scanning the tree line through binoculars. They'd established a temporary position in a rocky outcropping, not ideal, but the best the terrain offered. "You think they made it?" Timmy pressed. "Red knows what he's doing," Hawk replied, which wasn't an answer. Movement caught his eye, a flash of gray against white approximately 600 yards north. A German patrol, 6 men led by an officer, not random scouts, a hunting party. "Pack up," he ordered quietly. "We need to move." They descended, the outcropping using rocky terrain to mask their trail. 3 miles southeast lay the remains of a small village, bombed to rubble early in the German offensive. Beyond that, a river that might offer a path to friendly lines. They moved in silence, conserving energy. Hunger had become a constant companion, their rations exhausted 2 days ago. Hawk felt it in the weakness of his limbs, the occasional dizziness. Timmy was worse off. The boy's youth worked against him, his body burning energy faster. A distant crack split the silence, followed by a bullet whining overhead. Both men dropped to the ground. Sniper, Hawk breathed. He's firing blind, hoping for a reaction. A second shot kicked up snow 5 feet to their left, closer but still searching. On my mark, Hawk murmured. We break right, into those trees. Stay low. Move fast. Timmy nodded, tension visible in every line of his body. Now. They sprinted toward the tree line. A third shot split the air, wide by several feet. They plunged into the forest, ducking behind trees. He'll radio our position, Hawk said. We need to put distance between us. For the next hour they pushed through dense forest, changing direction frequently. Hawk set false trails, doubling back and using streams to mask their footprints. Old hunters' tricks from Montana. By midday they'd covered nearly 2 miles. The village should be just beyond the next ridge. Hawk allowed a brief rest, both men leaning against trees, chests heaving. You think that sniper was looking specifically for us? Timmy asked. No, probably routine patrol, but Kruger has everyone on alert. He really hates us, doesn't he? A ghost of a smile touched Timmy's lips. Not hate, Hawk corrected. Respect, maybe. We're a problem he needs to solve. A problem with a ticking clock attached. Every hour reduced their chances. Bodies. Weakening, German noose tightening. Let's move. Village should be just ahead. They crested the ridge cautiously, using trees for cover. The devastated village spread below. A dozen ruined buildings. No movement visible, but certain details troubled Hawk. No snow drifts against. Some walls, faint discolorations that might be disturbed ground. I don't like it, he murmured. Trap? Timmy asked. Maybe. Hawk focused on the remains of a church, its bell tower partially intact. A natural observation post. If Germans were occupying the village, they'd position a spotter there. Nothing moved. Still, instinct prickled at the back of Hawk's neck, the same feeling that had kept him alive hunting grizzlies in Montana. We circle around, he decided. Approach from the west instead. They had just begun to withdraw when the first shot rang out. Not from the village, from behind them. 3 German soldiers emerged from the trees, rifles raised. Run, he shouted, shoving Timmy toward the downslope. They plunged down the hillside as bullets tore through the space they'd occupied seconds before. No time for caution, just desperate. Flight toward the dubious shelter of the ruined village. Hawk realized the trap too late. As they reached the first buildings, gunfire erupted from multiple positions. Muzzle flashes from the church tower, from a half-collapsed house, from behind, a stone wall. They dove behind a garden wall as bullets chipped stone around them, pinned down caught in a crossfire. Cellar, Hawk gasped, pointing to a narrow opening in a nearby foundation. Go. Timmy sprinted for the opening, Hawk providing covering. First, the boy disappeared into the darkness. Hawk prepared to follow, but as he rose, pain exploded in his left shoulder, a hammer blow that spun him half around. Gritting his teeth, he staggered to the cellar entrance and half fell down the earthen steps. Timmy caught him at the bottom, dragging him away from the shaft of daylight. You're hit, the boy hissed, eyes wide with alarm. Grazed, Hawk managed, though he knew it was worse. Wet warmth spread down his arm. Check if there's another way out. Hawk examined his wound by touch. The bullet had passed through the meat of his shoulder, missing bone but leaving entry and exit wounds that bled freely. There's a tunnel, Timmy reported. Looks like it connects to the next building. Hawk tore a strip from his undershirt, binding the wound as best he could. Help me up. Supporting each other, they navigated the low tunnel, emerging into another cellar. Above, they could hear German voices and boots as soldiers searched the buildings. For the next hour, they played a deadly game of hide-and-seek, using the network of cellars and tunnels to evade their pursuers. The village residents had built an underground system, for storage originally, but clearly adapted during the occupation for more clandestine purposes. Eventually, they reached the final cellar in the chain, directly beneath the bombed church. No further tunnels offered escape. Hawk's shoulder throbbed mercilessly, his makeshift bandage soaked through. Blood loss was making him lightheaded. "We wait until dark," he whispered, "then try to break out to the north." The boy nodded, uncertainty clouding his face. "Will you make it that long?" A fair question. Hawk's strength was fading by the minute. "Have to," he replied simply. Hours crawled by, marked only by the gradual dimming of light through cracks in the ceiling. The German search continued, though with decreasing intensity as daylight waned. Hawk drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain alternating between fiery agony and dangerous numbness. Timmy kept watch, occasionally pressing snow to Hawk's forehead when fever threatened. "Hawk," Timmy's urgent whisper pierced the fog. "Someone's coming." Hawk forced himself to alertness, drawing his pistol. Footsteps approached, cautious but not stealthy. The cellar door creaked open. Both men raised their weapons. "Easy," came a familiar voice. "It's us." Red slipped through, the doorway followed by Slick. Both men looked haggard, their faces gaunt with exhaustion. "Jesus Christ," Red breathed, seeing Hawk's condition. "What happened?" "Sniper," Hawk managed. "Where's Ox?" A shadow crossed Red's face. "Outside. He took a hit. Bad one." "How did you find us?" Timmy asked, relief and suspicion mingling. "Heard. The Germans talking about cornering Americans in the village," Slick replied. "Figured it had to be you two." "We've been tracking you for the last day," Red added, kneeling to examine Hawk's wound. "You left a trail even the Germans could follow." The implication wasn't lost on Hawk. His plan to draw attention had worked too well. "Ox needs medical attention," Red continued, rebinding Hawk's shoulder with a proper dressing. "Bullet caught him in the leg. He's losing blood, can barely walk." "We rigged a stretcher," Slick added, "but we need somewhere to hole up. 5 men, 2 seriously wounded, surrounded by an enemy force of unknown size. Their situation had deteriorated to near hopeless." "The church," Hawk said finally. "Bell tower gives visibility, stone walls for protection." An hour later, under the cover of darkness, they made their move. Red and Slick returned with Ox between them, the big man barely conscious, his normally ruddy face ashen. Together, they navigated through the cellar network to an access point near the church. The night was bitterly cold. Hawk, leaning heavily on Timmy, surveyed the open ground between their position and the church. No guards visible, but that meant little. "Straight across," he whispered. "Fast as we can. Red, Slick, you take Ox. Timmy and I will cover." They crossed the open space in a stumbling rush, expecting bullets at any moment. None came. They reached the church's side door, slipping inside the shattered sanctuary. Moonlight filtered through the collapsed roof, casting ghostly shadows across toppled pews and a broken altar. "Upstairs," Hawk directed, indicating a narrow, stone staircase leading to the bell tower. Defensible position, they established their refuge in what remained of the bell chamber. The stone walls provided shelter from the wind, while the elevated position offered clear lines of sight in all directions. For the first time in days, they were together again. But their reunion brought little comfort. 2 men seriously wounded, supplies exhausted, ammunition critically low. And outside, somewhere in the darkness, Kruger's forces waited. "You were supposed to be headed southeast," Hawk said to Red when they had a moment alone. "What went wrong?" Red's expression hardened. "What went wrong? Your plan went wrong." The words came out harsh, weeks of bottled frustration finding release. We ran straight into a German patrol 10 miles from the separation point, lost half our supplies getting away. Hawk absorbed this, too drained to offer defense. And you decided to come back for us. Ox insisted, Red replied, though his eyes said it had been his decision too. Wouldn't leave you behind. Across the bell chamber, Ox lay on an improvised bed of tattered vestments, his breathing labored. Seeing him reduced to this drove home the gravity of their situation. So what's the plan now, Hawk? Red asked, his voice carrying an edge. Another brilliant strategy to get us all killed? The question hung in the air, sharp as a bayonet. From his position by the window, Slick turned to watch, sensing the confrontation brewing. We hold position, Hawk replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. Wait for a gap in their perimeter. Red laughed, a bitter sound. A gap? They've got us surrounded, probably calling in reinforcements as we speak. You have a better idea? Hawk challenged. Yeah, I do. We surrender. Red delivered the words like a challenge. Get medical attention for Ox and you. Live to fight another day. Surrender, Hawk tasted the word. After what we saw at the convoy? After what Kruger did to those prisoners on the radio? At least we'd have a chance. Red's voice rose. Better than dying in the goddamn church for nothing. He's right, Slick interjected quietly. We're out of options, Hawk, out of food, almost out of ammo. Ox needs a doctor or he's dead by morning. The defection stung. Hawk looked to Timmy, the last member of his dwindling coalition. The boy met his gaze steadily but said nothing. But certainty had abandoned him. The wound in his shoulder throbbed in time with his pulse, each beat carrying away more strength. I don't have all the answers, Hawk admitted, finally the words scraping his throat. Never did. The confession landed heavily. Red's anger seemed to deflate, replaced by something more complicated. Disappointment, perhaps, or recognition of their shared humanity. None of us do, Red said more gently, but we need to face facts. We can't win this fight. So we just give up? Timmy spoke at last, his young voice cracking. After everything? Not giving up, Slick corrected, being realistic. Germans will treat us as POWs. War's going badly for them, they need bargaining chips. A silence fell, broken only by Ox's labored breathing. I won't order it, Hawk said finally. Can't. But I won't stop anyone who wants to try. Red shook his head slowly. Damn you, Hawk. I'm not leaving you behind either. Before anyone could respond, a crackling voice split the night, amplified, coming from outside the church. Attention, American soldiers. Lieutenant Kruger's distinctive accent carried clearly through the cold air. We know you are in the church. We know 2 of you are wounded. The squad exchanged alarmed glances. How could Kruger know their exact position, their condition? I offer you this one final opportunity, the German continued. Surrender by sunrise, and you will receive medical attention and treatment according to the Geneva Convention. Hawk dragged himself to the window, peering cautiously over the sill. German troops had surrounded the church, positioned in a tight perimeter. No weak points, no gaps. If you choose to resist, Kruger's voice held no emotion, you will be hunted down without mercy. The transmission ended, leaving only the bitter cold and the weight of impossible choices. He's bluffing, Hawk insisted, though his conviction had eroded to almost nothing. Is he? Red challenged. Look out there, Hawk. Really look. This isn't about winning anymore. It's about choosing how we lose. The word struck with the force of truth. For days, Hawk had led his men through hell on the strength of his strategic mind and unshakable will. He'd made them believe survival was possible. But the evidence before him told a different story. Ox dying by inches, his own strength failing, ammunition nearly exhausted. Kruger had outplayed them, drawn the noose tight around their necks. I'll go, Timmy said suddenly. If someone needs to check if Kruger's honest about medical treatment, I'll go. The offer, made with such simple courage, landed like a physical blow. "No," Hawk said firmly. "We stay together. Whatever happens, we face it as a squad." "Then what do we do?" Slick pressed. "Sunrise is 4 hours away." Hawk closed his eyes, feeling the weight of leadership pressing down on him like a mountain. Every decision he'd made had led them here, to this ruined church, this impossible choice. "I don't know," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. "I just don't know." In the silence that followed, something shifted between the men. The revelation of Hawk's doubt didn't diminish him, it humanized him. He was no longer the infallible strategist, but simply a man trying his best against impossible odds. Timmy moved to sit beside him, their shoulders touching in silent solidarity. After a moment, Red joined them, then Slick. Only Ox remained, apart, his labored breathing a reminder of how little time they had left. "Get some rest," Red said finally, the harshness gone from his voice. "I'll take first watch. We'll figure it out by morning." As the others settled into uneasy sleep, Hawk stared into the darkness, the burden of leadership heavier than ever. Outside, Kruger's forces waited patiently, confident in their advantage. Inside, 4 men placed their trust in a leader who had finally run out of tricks. By sunrise, they would need to make their choice: resist, and almost certainly die, or surrender, and place their fate in the hands of an enemy who had already shown his ruthlessness. Hawk's hand moved to the hunting knife at his belt, his last connection to the Montana wilderness that had shaped him. Some predators, cornered and wounded, chose to charge rather than submit. It was in their nature. But these men deserved more than a glorious last stand. They deserved a chance, however slim, to see their homes again. As the long night stretched toward dawn, Hawk wrestled with the hardest decision of his life. Not a tactical problem to be solved, but a moral weight to be carried. The burden of leadership had never felt so crushing nor so lonely. First light crept across the eastern horizon, painting the broken church in hues of pale gold. Hawk stood at the bell tower window watching German soldiers take up position around the perimeter. Behind him, the squad stirred. Ox's condition had worsened overnight, his breathing shallow, his massive frame racked by fever. Red checked the big man's bandages, his expression grim. Slick inventoried their remaining ammunition with meticulous care. Timmy simply watched Hawk, waiting for direction. Kruger's ultimatum hung over them: surrender or die. Neither option appealed to Hawk. "Time's almost up," Red said quietly. "Germans are getting ready to move in." Hawk nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line where he'd spotted movement. Not regular troops, scouts moving with careful precision. "We're not surrendering," Hawk said finally. "I figured as much. So we die here?" "No." Something had crystallized in Hawk's mind during the long night hours, a desperate plan. "We're going to make Kruger regret ever hunting us." He turned to face his men, who watched with a mixture of exhaustion and wary hope. "I have a plan," Hawk said. "It's not pretty and it's not safe, but it might just work." "Let's hear it," Slick said skeptically. "What miracle are you proposing now?" Hawk knelt painfully, using a charred stick to sketch a crude map on the stone floor. 3 miles northeast of here, there's a narrow pass that cuts through this ridgeline, steep cliffs on both sides, heavily wooded. Perfect for an ambush. "And how exactly do we get there?" Red asked. "In case you haven't noticed, we're surrounded, with 2 wounded men who can barely walk." Hawk nodded toward the cellar access. "The tunnel network, the ones we used to get in here. They extend farther than we explored. I could feel the air flow. I'm betting they were built to provide escape routes from the village." "That's a big assumption," Slick muttered. "It's all we've got," Hawk replied. "But even if the tunnels get us out, we still have a bigger problem. Kruger won't just let us walk away. We need to convince him to follow us into the pass on our terms." "Bait," Red realized. "You want to use us as bait." "Not all of us," Hawk corrected. "Just me." "That's suicide," Red stated flatly. Not if we do it right, Hawk countered. He outlined his strategy, a desperate gamble that hinged on precise timing and Kruger's predictable pursuit. We rigged the pass with the last of our explosives, set deadfalls, traps, anything that can turn the terrain itself into a weapon. I lead Kruger's men in, while you three set up firing positions on the high ground. When they reach the kill zone, we bring the whole mountain down on them. And Ox? Slick asked, gesturing to their wounded comrade. Hawk's expression tightened. He stays hidden until it's over. We can't risk moving him that far. A heavy silence fell. They all understood what Hawk wasn't saying, that Ox might not survive long enough to be rescued. I don't like leaving him, Red said. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. None of us do, Hawk agreed. But our choices are limited. This way, at least some of us might survive to tell his story. Ox's eyes had opened, fever bright but lucid. Do it, he rasped, his normally booming voice reduced to a whisper. I'll only slow you down, just leave me a pistol with a round in it. Hawk moved to his friend's side, clasping his massive hand. That's not happening. We'll hide you somewhere safe, come back for you when it's over. Ox managed a weak smile. Always were a terrible liar, Hawk. Slick called urgently from the window. Movement outside, they're forming up. Hawk joined him, watching as German troops organized into assault formations. Kruger's patience had evidently run out. We need to move, Hawk decided. Now. They worked quickly, gathering their supplies. Red and Slick fashioned a litter from broken pews to transport Ox, while Hawk and Timmy scoured the church for anything useful. In the sacristy, Timmy discovered an unexpected treasure, a cache of resistance supplies hidden behind a false wall. Dynamite fuses and blasting caps, likely stored for sabotage operations. Looks like someone was planning their own party, Timmy remarked. And now we're going to throw one, Hawk replied, examining the explosives. The first German probe came. Minutes later, a cautious entry team testing the church's defenses. Slick dispatched them with silent efficiency, but more would follow. Tunnels now, Hawk ordered. They descended into the darkness beneath the church, Red and Slick struggling with Ox's litter, while Hawk and Timmy led the way. The tunnel network was more extensive than they'd realized, branching in multiple directions and connecting various buildings throughout the village. After what felt like hours but was likely only 40 minutes, they reached what appeared to be a dead end. Hawk examined the stone wall carefully. This was sealed recently, he concluded. Help me break through. Using rifle butts and entrenching tools, they gradually weakened the barrier until it gave way, revealing a passage that sloped upward toward daylight. The exit emerged in a thicket of brambles nearly a quarter-mile beyond the village edge, well past the German cordon. We made it, Timmy breathed. First step, Hawk cautioned. Long way to go. They concealed the tunnel entrance and assessed their position. The ridgeline Hawk had identified was visible to the northeast, its slopes dense with pine forest. Between their position and the pass lay nearly 3 miles of open ground. We'll never make it across that with Ox, Red said. There's an abandoned forester's cabin about half a mile east, Hawk replied. We can secure Ox there before moving to the pass. The trek to the cabin tested their endurance to its limits. Hawk's shoulder wound had reopened, blood seeping through his bandages. The others fared little better. Exhaustion, hunger, and the bitter cold sapping their strength. Only Timmy seemed to draw on some hidden reserve, his youthful resilience, carrying him forward. The cabin, when they reached it, proved better than expected. Solidly built, partially stocked with firewood and well concealed by surrounding forest. They settled Ox as comfortably as possible, building a small fire in the stone hearth. You know the Germans will find this place eventually, Ox said as they prepared to leave him. When Kruger realizes you've slipped his net, he'll widen the search. Then we'll have to make sure he's too busy chasing us, Hawk replied. He placed his spare pistol within Ox's reach, just in case. Ox nodded, understanding the unspoken promise. Make those bastards pay. With daylight fading, Hawk led the remaining squad members toward the pass. The going was treacherous, deep snow concealing deadfalls, ice making every slope a potential death trap. They reached the pass as darkness settled. It was everything Hawk had hoped for, a natural bottleneck, flanked by steep cliffs, the forest growing right to the edge of the narrow trail. A perfect killing ground. "We have until morning to prepare," Hawk told his men. "Kruger will discover we're gone soon. He'll track us here. I'm counting on it." "And then what?" Slick asked. "We're 3 men against his entire force." "We use every advantage," Hawk replied. "The terrain, the explosives, most importantly his own assumptions. Kruger thinks we're desperate, running scared. He won't expect us to stand and fight." They worked through the night, setting their traps. With methodical precision, the resistance explosives were positioned at key points along the cliff faces, wired to remote detonators. Deadfalls were rigged, massive logs suspended above the trail. Even the trees themselves became weapons, their trunks partially sawn through so they could be toppled to block escape routes. As dawn approached, Red and Hawk took a moment alone, surveying their handiwork. "You know, I never gave this plan much of a chance," Red admitted. "Thought you were leading us on a fool's errand." "Might still be," Hawk acknowledged. Red shook his head. "No, I see it now. What you've been doing all along. The cat and mouse game with Kruger. You weren't just keeping us alive, you were learning his patterns, studying how he thinks. 'Know your enemy,'" Hawk quoted. "My father taught me that, tracking mountain lions, the most dangerous predator is the one you understand." "And you understand Kruger?" "Enough to know he won't be able to resist this chase. His pride won't allow it." Red clasped Hawk's good shoulder. "Then I'm with you. All the way to the end." As final preparations were made, Timmy approached Hawk, a folded paper in his hand. "Can you make sure this gets home if, you know?" Hawk accepted the letter, tucking it inside his jacket. "Write your mother?" Timmy nodded. "And my girl. Told them I was sorry for lying about my age to enlist. That I'd do it again knowing what I know now." A shadow crossed his young face. "Think I'll ever see them again?" Hawk considered the question seriously. "I can't promise you'll make it home, Timmy, but I can promise that what we do here matters. That's what separates men from boys, understanding that some things are worth dying for." The young man straightened, something resolute hardening in his expression. "I'm ready." By first light, their preparations were complete. Hawk outlined the final elements of their strategy. Red and Timmy would take elevated positions on opposite sides of the pass, providing crossfire coverage. Slick would manage the explosives, triggering them when Kruger's forces reached the kill zone. Hawk himself would act as the bait, leading the Germans into the trap. "We all know this is a long shot," Hawk concluded. "But it's our shot. Make every bullet count, no matter what happens to me. Stick to the plan." "And after?" Slick as Ked. "If this works, if we break Kruger's force, head south," Hawk directed. 15 miles to Allied lines. Find Ox if you can. Tell our story." What remained unspoken was the likelihood that some or all of them wouldn't survive to make that journey. As the others moved to their positions, Hawk took a moment alone. His shoulder wound had stabilized, though the pain remained constant. He was down to his rifle with half a magazine, his pistol with a full clip, and his hunting knife. Not much to face a German battalion, but it would have to do. He thought of Montana, of the mountains and forests that had shaped him, taught him, the patience and cunning that had kept him alive this far. Strange, how a man's path could lead him from those peaceful valleys to this frozen hell. Hawk moved to his designated position, ready to begin the most dangerous hunt of his life. Not as prey this time, but as the predator. The first indication that their escape had been discovered came mid-morning. Distant shouts carrying across the valley, followed by flares shot into the sky. Kruger had sprung his trap only to find his quarry gone. "Right on schedule," Hawk murmured, watching through binoculars as German troops spread out from the village. He'd anticipated this response, had counted on Kruger's methodical nature. What he hadn't counted on was the German commander's caution. Rather than immediately pursuing their trail, Kruger held his forces back, sending only small scouting parties. "He's being careful," Red observed. "Thinks it might be another trick." "Then we'll have to convince him otherwise," Hawk replied. He implemented the next phase of his plan, a series of false trails leading toward the pass but with deliberate inconsistencies. Some suggested a group in panicked flight, others a more measured withdrawal. The conflicting signs would pique Kruger's interest, challenge his intellect. By early afternoon, the strategy bore fruit. German reconnaissance units had picked up their trail, tracking them toward the pass. Hawk noted the increased radio traffic, the purposeful movements of Kruger's forces as they consolidated for pursuit. "They're coming," he informed the others, via hand signals. "Get ready." He took his position at the far end of the pass, making himself just visible enough to be spotted by the lead German scouts. When they reported his presence, Kruger would commit his forces to the pursuit, sending them straight into the prepared killing ground. Hawk checked the detonator wires one final time, ensuring Slick had clean connections to all explosive charges. Tested his rifle action, confirming it would function in the biting cold. Adjusted his position to favor his wounded shoulder. And then he waited, as he had waited so many times before on hunting trips with his father. The key to a successful ambush was patience, letting the prey commit fully before springing the trap. The first German scouts appeared at the mouth of the pass an hour later, moving with cautious precision. They advanced slowly, checking for traps, maintaining proper intervals. Hawk allowed them to spot him, then staged a convincing retreat deeper, into the pass. The scouts, rather than pursuing immediately, held position and reported back. The main German force arrived 30 minutes later. Through his binoculars, Hawk could see Kruger himself directing operations, studying the pass with clinical detachment. The German officer sensed danger. Hawk could tell from his body language the way he deployed his men. For a moment, Hawk feared Kruger might abandon the pursuit, might choose to shell the pass with mortars rather than commit his troops to a frontal advance. But then he saw the German commander issue orders, saw the assault teams form up. Pride. That was Kruger's flaw. The intellectual need to defeat his opponent directly, to prove his superiority. The German advance began, troops moving into the pass with textbook precision. Hawk retreated before them, maintaining just enough distance to keep them committed to the pursuit. Step by careful step, he led them deeper into the trap. When the lead German elements reached the first marker, a distinctive boulder near the narrowest point of the pass, Hawk gave the signal. Red and Timmy opened fire from their elevated positions, targeting officers and radio operators. Simultaneously, Slick triggered the first explosive charge, collapsing a section of cliff face onto the trail behind the German force. Cutting off their retreat, chaos erupted as the Germans sought cover, returning fire blindly toward the ridge lines. Hawk picked his targets carefully, each shot meant to increase the confusion. The second phase of explosives detonated, bringing down massive sections of the cliffs above the German positions. Men screamed as tons of rock and snow crashed down, crushing some outright and trapping others. Through the dust and confusion, Hawk caught glimpses of Kruger, the German commander, maintaining remarkable composure as he directed his men to defensible positions. Even now, facing disaster, the man's tactical mind remained sharp. A fresh volley of German fire forced Hawk to duck behind a boulder. Return fire from Red and Timmy kept the enemy pinned, but their ammunition was limited. This phase of the battle needed to end quickly. "Slick," Hawk called over the radio they'd salvaged. "Final charges now." The biggest explosions yet rocked the pass, triggering not just the planted dynamite, but an avalanche that had been precariously balanced on the western slope. A wall of snow and debris thundered down, engulfing the main German force. When the echoes faded and the dust began to settle, an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. Hawk surveyed the devastation through eyes stinging with cordite and rock, dust. The pass was transformed, filled with rubble and snow, German bodies partially buried throughout. Those still alive were dazed, wounded, separated from their command structure. "Hawk!" Red's voice crackled over the radio. "We got most of them, but Kruger's still alive. South end of the pass with about a dozen men," Hawk acknowledged, already moving to flank the German position. Red and Timmy would maintain covering fire from above while he maneuvered for the kill. Slick, his explosives expended, would join them to provide additional firepower. They had succeeded beyond reasonable hope, reduced Kruger's battalion to a handful of survivors, turned the hunter into the hunted. But the German commander was still dangerous, perhaps more so now that he had nothing left to lose. As Hawk approached Kruger's position, a strange sense of inevitability settled over him. Their contest had always been leading to this moment. Predator facing predator, each with a final card to play. Behind him, the devastated pass stood as testament to what desperate men could accomplish against overwhelming odds. Before him lay the final confrontation, the culmination of their deadly chess match. The endgame had begun. Night fell like a shroud, bringing a howling blizzard that transformed the battlefield into a whirling chaos of white. Perfect conditions for what Hawk had planned. From his position on the western ridge, he watched Kruger's remaining forces regroup. The Germans had suffered heavy casualties from the initial ambush and avalanche. At least half their number lay buried beneath rock and snow. But the survivors, roughly 20 men under Kruger's direct command, had rallied at the southern end. "They're digging in," Red reported over their salvaged radio, "setting up machine gun positions." "Good," Hawk replied. "Let them get comfortable." His plan relied on the storm, on darkness, on Kruger believing he'd weathered the worst of the Yao attack. The German commander would expect them to retreat, to use the blizzard as cover for their escape. Instead, Hawk intended to push closer, to become the ghosts that haunted this frozen hell. "Slick," he called quietly into the radio. "Status on those explosives?" Static crackled before Slick's voice came through. 3 charges left. Positioned along the eastern ridge, ready to drop the whole damn mountain if needed. "Save them," Hawk ordered. "We move to phase 2. He slung his rifle and began his careful descent. The blizzard intensified, visibility dropping to mere yards. Deadly hazard for most, but perfect concealment for Hawk's purpose. He moved like a wraith through the storm, drawing on every hunting skill he'd learned in Montana's wilderness. At the edge of the German perimeter, he paused. Through swirling snow, he could make out soldiers huddled behind hastily constructed snow barricades. He slipped past their outer picket, exploiting a blind spot between 2 sentries. 30 yards, and he found what he sought. A field radio setup partially sheltered by a tarp. The operator hunched over it, back turned. Hawk's knife made no sound as it slid between the man's ribs. He caught the body as it slumped, lowering it silently to the snow. For the next 10 minutes, he worked quickly, adjusting the radio settings, preparing the deception that would sow confusion. When finished, he retreated the way he'd come. Back on the ridge, he signaled Red and Slick to begin the second phase. The dance of death commenced. Red, positioned on the northwestern slope, fired a single shot. The crack echoed across the pass, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere in the howling wind. A German fell, the others swiveling to return fire at a target they couldn't see. As they did, Slick triggered a small explosive charge on the opposite ridge, not enough to cause damage but sufficient to divide their attention. The Germans split their fire, shooting blindly into the storm. Hawk keyed the captured radio, speaking in perfect German. "Heavy fire from the north ridge. American reinforcements, at least a platoon." The stolen authentication codes ensured his transmission would be accepted as genuine. The misinformation spread instantly, soldiers redeploying to meet this phantom threat. "American movement southeast quadrant," he transmitted minutes later. "Request immediate support." Another German squad broke from the main position, pushing into the blizzard, toward non-existent enemies. Kruger's force was fragmenting exactly as planned. For an hour, they continued this deadly ballet, Red and Slick firing from constantly shifting positions, while Hawk fed false information through the captured radio. The Germans fired thousands of rounds into empty snow, chasing ghosts that materialized. and vanished at will. But Kruger was too clever to be fooled indefinitely. After several fruitless pursuits, the German commander called his remaining forces back to their central position. Radio discipline tightened, with Kruger himself verifying all reports. "He's adapting," Hawk murmured. "Change of plans. Red, Slick, converge on my position. We go to close quarters engagement." It was a risky pivot. Their advantage lay in mobility and deception, not direct confrontation. But Kruger had neutralized their psychological tactics. Now they needed to strike physically before the Germans could fully reorganize. Red and Slick joined him minutes later, materializing from the storm like specters. "We're getting low on ammo," Red reported. "Maybe 20 rounds each." "Make them count," Hawk replied, outlining his adjusted strategy, a three-pronged attack exploiting gaps in the German perimeter. "Where's Timmy?" Slick asked suddenly, looking around with alarm. A cold that had nothing to do with the blizzard settled in Hawk's chest. The boy had been positioned on the far eastern ridge, providing covering fire throughout their operations. He should have withdrawn with the others when called. "Hawk to Timmy," he spoke urgently into the radio. "Report position." Static answered him. Then, faintly through the storm, they heard it. The distinctive chatter of a German MG-42 machine gun from the eastern ridge. "He's pinned down," Red realized, already turning in that direction. "Wait," Hawk ordered, though every instinct screamed to rush to Timmy's aid. "We need to be smart about this. Slick, circle north, come in behind that position. Red, with me, we'll create a diversion." They separated, Slick vanishing into the storm while Hawk and Red worked their way toward the machine gun position. The weapon fell silent, but Hawk knew better than to hope for good news. The Germans were conserving ammunition, waiting for a clear target. "When I give the signal," Hawk told Red, "we hit them with everything we've got. Draw their fire away from the east ridge." Red nodded grimly, checking his rifle's action. "Ready." Hawk dropped his hand sharply. Both men opened fire, targeting the German position with controlled bursts. The response was immediate. The MG-42 swiveled, its rapid fire cutting through the storm toward them. They dropped flat as bullets whipped overhead, chewing through pine branches and kicking up snow. The Germans had taken the bait, focusing their heaviest weapon away from where Timmy was trapped. "Hold position," Hawk ordered. "Keep them busy." He keyed his radio, intent on contacting Slick. Before he could transmit, Timmy's voice broke through the static. "Don't come for me." The boy's voice was calm, determined. "I'm hit bad, but I've got the detonator for the eastern charges." Hawk's blood ran cold. "Timmy, hold position. We're coming to get you." "No time," Timmy replied, his voice weakening. "Germans are advancing up the slope, dozens of them. Must have been holding a reserve force." "Listen to me," Timmy continued. "I can see them setting up a mortar position. If they get it operational, you're all dead." "We'll take it out," Hawk insisted. "Just hold on." A weak laugh came through the static. "Always were a terrible liar, Hawk, just like you told Ox." A pause filled only with labored breathing. "I've led them right to the charges. When they reach me, I'm triggering the detonator." The implications struck Hawk like a physical blow. The eastern charges were the largest they'd planted, enough to bring down a significant portion of the ridge. Timmy would be at ground zero. "Timmy, don't," Hawk began. "Tell my mother I wasn't afraid," Timmy interrupted. "And Hawk, thanks for making me a soldier." The radio went silent. Hawk called the boy's name repeatedly, desperation edging his voice. No response. From the eastern ridge came shouts in German, commands, warnings. Then a single, earth-shattering explosion that momentarily drowned out even the howling storm. The mountainside shuddered, and tons of rock and ice broke free, thundering, down in a devastating avalanche. When the echoes faded and the snow dust settled, the eastern side of the pass had changed shape entirely. Where there had been a ridge topped with pine trees, now there was only a massive debris field, burying everything, Germans and one young American soldier alike. "Jesus Christ," Red whispered. his face ashen. The kid actually did it. Hawk stared at the devastation, something breaking inside him. Timmy, barely 19, who'd lied about his age to enlist, who'd followed Hawk with unwavering faith through this frozen hell, was gone. His sacrifice had likely saved them all, but the cost was unbearable. For the first time since their ordeal began, Hawk felt his composure crack. His hands trembled from grief so overwhelming it threatened to paralyze him. Red gripped his shoulder, hard. "Later," he said firmly. "Mourn him later. Right now we finish this." The words penetrated Hawk's shock. Timmy's sacrifice would mean nothing if they died here. The mission remained: eliminate Kruger, break the German force, find a way home. "Slick," Hawk called into the radio. "Report position." "Northeastern quadrant," came the reply. "I saw what happened. Germans are in complete disarray. Now's our chance." The storm began to slacken, visibility improving. The German survivors were regrouping, but their movements had lost the previous discipline. Some appeared to be arguing, others looking to their flanks with evident fear. "Kruger," Hawk murmured, scanning the German position. "Where are you?" A figure emerged from the central German position, tall, straight-backed despite the chaos around him. Even at this distance, Hawk recognized the distinctive bearing of the man who had hunted them so relentlessly. "There," he pointed. "Their commander." Red raised his rifle, settling into a sniper's stance. "I've got him. Just say the word." "No," Hawk decided. "Not like that. I want him to know who killed him." He keyed the radio. "Slick, create a diversion. On the north flank, Red covering fire on my signal. I'm going in." "In?" Red questioned incredulously. "That's suicide, Hawk." "Not an assault," Hawk corrected. "A hunt." Before Red could object further, Hawk was moving, descending the slope with predatory focus. His mind had entered a strange, crystalline clarity, grief, and rage transmuted into deadly purpose. Red's covering fire erupted right on cue, forcing the Germans to seek cover. Simultaneously, Slick triggered his diversion, a series of small charges creating the impression of an attack from the north. Between the confusion and the still swirling snow, Hawk penetrated the German perimeter with surprising ease. He moved, from shadow to shadow, eliminating sentries with his knife when necessary, always advancing toward the central command position. 20 yards from Kruger's position, a German soldier spotted him, shouting a warning. Hawk's shot dropped him, but the alarm was raised. Cover blown, he abandoned stealth for speed, sprinting the final distance through a hail of bullets. He crashed into the command post, a crude shelter formed of fallen logs and a tarp, to find Kruger waiting, pistol aimed directly at Hawk's chest. "Sergeant," the German officer greeted calmly. "I wondered when you would come for me personally." "Your plan was brilliant," Kruger continued, though his pistol never wavered. "The false radio transmissions, the ghost tactics, using the terrain as a weapon. In different circumstances, I would have been honored to serve with such a commander." "You killed my men," Hawk replied, his voice hard. "As you killed mine," Kruger countered without rancor. "It is the nature of war, is it not? But I respect worthy adversaries, and you have proven most worthy." "The boy on the ridge," Kruger said, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his features. "That was courage, pure courage." The mention of Timmy rekindled the rage in Hawk's chest. His finger tightened on his trigger. Kruger must have seen the shift in his eyes. "We are not so different, you and I. Both hunters, both willing to sacrifice others to achieve victory." "There's a difference," Hawk said. "My men chose to follow me. They believed in something worth dying for." "And you believe my men do not?" Kruger asked. "We all have our causes, Sergeant. The tragedy is that men like us must be enemies." For a moment, Hawk sensed the strange bond that had formed between them during their deadly contest. Predator recognizing predator. But then he remembered Timmy's final words. Remembered Ox, possibly already dead in the forester's cabin. Remembered the convoy massacred in the snow. "You're right about one thing. Hawk said quietly. This ends between us. What happened next occurred in fractions of seconds. Kruger began to squeeze his trigger. Simultaneously, Hawk dropped to one knee, the German's bullet passing over his shoulder as his own shot caught Kruger in the chest. The German commander staggered back. His pistol fired again, the bullet grazing Hawk's temple. Hawk fired twice more, center mass, driving Kruger to his knees. You won, Kruger gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. As I suspected you might. Hawk stood over him, watching the light fade from his enemy's eyes. No triumph, no satisfaction, only the hollow completion of necessity. Your men are finished, Hawk said. Surrender them and some might live. Kruger coughed, blood staining the snow. They will fight to the last. It is what I trained them to do. Then they'll die, Hawk stated simply. Pointlessly. A strange smile touched Kruger's lips. Is any death in war not pointless, Sergeant? He shuddered. We played our game, to its conclusion, but the war continues without us. With those words, Lieutenant Heinrich Kruger died in the snow of the Ardennes. The chess match concluded. Hawk stepped out of the command post to find the battle shifting decisively. Without Kruger's leadership, the German resistance was fragmenting. Some soldiers had thrown down their weapons, hands raised in surrender. Others fought on with desperate fury. Red and Slick converged on his position, both showing signs of the brutal fighting. Fresh wounds, blood-spattered uniforms, eyes haunted. Kruger? Red asked. Dead, Hawk confirmed. His men are broken. We need to mop up those still fighting and secure the prisoners. They worked methodically through the battlefield. By dawn, it was over. Of Kruger's original force of nearly 100 men, only 14 survived as prisoners. The rest lay buried in the snow or scattered across the pass, victims of Hawk's strategy and Timmy's sacrifice. The storm had passed completely, revealing a transformed landscape under the cold morning sun. The pass was nearly unrecognizable. Massive avalanche debris fields, bomb craters, the detritus of battle strewn across virgin snow. Hawk stood on the western ridge, surveying the scene with Red and Slick flanking him. None had emerged unscathed. Slick nursed a bullet wound to his arm. Red had taken shrapnel to his leg, walking with a pronounced limp. Hawk himself sported a collection of wounds. His original shoulder injury, the bullet grazed to his temple, numerous cuts from close quarter. Fighting, but they were alive. 3 out of 5. Better odds than they had any right to expect. We should check on Ox, Slick said, breaking the silence. If he's still, we'll head back to the cabin, Hawk agreed. Then south toward our lines, prisoners, in tow. What about Timmy? Red asked quietly. Hawk gazed at the eastern avalanche field, the boy's grave marked only by the devastation he'd caused with his final act. We can't recover him now, Hawk said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. After the war, maybe. For now, we remember, and we make sure his sacrifice meant something. As they prepared to move out, Hawk found himself staring at the spot where Timmy had made his last stand. The image of the boy would haunt him forever. War created ghosts not just of the dead, but of the living as well. Hawk felt it already. The phantom weight of leadership decisions, the whispered questions of what he might have done differently, the faces of those lost under his command. He touched the letter in his breast pocket. Timmy's final words to his family. One promise at least he could keep. The battle was won. Kruger was defeated. But as they turned away from the devastated pass, Hawk knew the true cost couldn't be measured in tactical victories or enemy casualties. It lay in the empty space beside them where Timmy should have been walking, in the uncertainty of Ox's fate, in the innocence stripped away by necessary violence. They moved south, 3 battered soldiers and their prisoners, leaving behind a battlefield that would soon be erased by winter's continuing snowfall. Behind them, the ghosts of the Ardennes watched in silence, witnesses to both the horror and the heroism of men pushed beyond their limits. Somewhere ahead lay the American lines and whatever passed for safety in this war. But first, they had a cabin to reach, a comrade to find, either to rescue or to bury, and 15 miles of enemy territory to cross. Their war wasn't over yet. 3 sets of footprints marred the snow-blanketed forest. Hawk walked point, Red and Slick following, their vigor drained by combat and grief. No one had spoken for nearly an hour. Words seemed inadequate after Timmy's sacrifice. Dawn revealed their position near the forest edge, where trees thinned before an open valley. In the distance stood an old border outpost, abandoned but defensible. And moving toward it, leaving dark tracks in the virgin snow, Kruger and his remaining men. There, Hawk pointed, looks like 5, maybe 6 of them. Red squinted through his rifle scope. Kruger's in the lead. Got a clear shot. Not yet, Hawk cautioned. If we take Kruger out first, the others might scatter. We need to finish this completely. Why? Slick asked, the question hanging heavy. We've broken their main force. Why not just head for our lines? Hawk met his gaze. Because they know we're here. Because if even one makes it back to report, they'll send more after us. Because Timmy and Ox deserve better. Slick nodded slowly, accepting the logic if not embracing it. What's the play? Red asked. Hawk studied the outpost where Kruger's group was now disappearing inside. They'll fortify, expecting us to follow. We'll give them what they expect, but not how they expect it. He outlined his approach, simple by necessity. Slick would create a diversion at the front while Hawk and Red infiltrated through a partially collapsed rear wall. Classic hammer and anvil. And if they're ready for us? Slick questioned. Then we adapt, Hawk replied. We always do. They circled wide around the valley floor, using the tree line for cover. The outpost was larger than initially apparent, a former customs checkpoint. 2 stories of weathered stone, small windows designed for defense, a courtyard partially visible through a crumbling wall. 20 minutes, Hawk told Slick, then hit them hard and loud. Keep them focused forward. Slick checked his watch, nodded once, then slipped away. Think Ox made it? Red asked suddenly. Hawk couldn't lie. Don't know. He's tough. But that wound was bad. First Timmy, maybe Ox. Red's voice trailed off. Just feels like we're paying too high a price. For what? A strategic victory in a forgotten corner of the Ardennes. For each other, Hawk corrected. That's all any soldier really fights for in the end. Not flags or generals or territory. Just the men beside him. Red checked his rifle. Let's finish it then, for the ones who aren't beside us anymore. They moved in painful silence toward the outpost's vulnerable rear section. Hawk's shoulder wound throbbed with each movement. Red wasn't faring better. His limp, more pronounced as fatigue, deepened. At the collapsed wall, they paused, listening. Muffled German voices carried in the still air. Kruger issuing orders, positioning his men for the attack they expected from the front. On my signal, Hawk whispered. Wait for Slick's diversion. Then we... A tremendous explosion cut him off. The blast wave shaking snow from nearby trees. Slick had used their last demolition charge. The perfect diversion. Now, Hawk urged, and they surged through the gap. They entered a debris-strewn courtyard. Across it, Kruger's men were scrambling to defend the front entrance. Hawk and Red opened fire simultaneously, catching the Germans in a deadly crossfire. 2 fell immediately. The others dove for cover, returning fire with the desperation of cornered men. Bullets chipped stone around Hawk as he rolled behind a collapsed pillar. Red took position behind a rusted truck, his rifle cracking methodically. Through the chaos, Hawk caught glimpses of Kruger directing his men, still composed, still dangerous. The German commander had retreated into the main building, using its sturdy walls for protection. For 5 minutes, the firefight raged with neither side gaining advantage. Then Slick's voice came over their radio. Running low on ammo, can't keep this pressure up much longer. They needed to break the stalemate. Hawk spotted a side door, partially obscured, but potentially unguarded. Red, cover me, I'm going for that entrance, draw their fire right. Red nodded, then unleashed a barrage. Hawk sprinted across the exposed courtyard, bullets kicking up snow at his heels. He reached the door, shouldered it open, and rolled inside just as return fire peppered the wall behind him. The interior was dim and cold. Hawk moved silently through what had once been an office. From somewhere deeper, he could hear Kruger's voice, still calm, still issuing orders. A floorboard creaked behind him. Hawk whirled to find himself facing a German soldier no older than Timmy had been. The boy's eyes widened, his weapon only half raised. For a fraction of a second, they stared at each other, two young men caught in a war neither had created. Then training took over. Hawk fired first, a clean shot that dropped the German where he stood. No time for regret, only the mission. He continued deeper, navigating a maze of abandoned rooms. The sounds of battle echoed, Slick's attack from the front, Red's covering fire from the courtyard. Hawk followed the sound of Kruger's voice, drawn to this final confrontation. He entered what had once been the main inspection hall. In the center stood Kruger, conferring with his remaining officer, a tall, scarred veteran with the rigid posture of career military. Neither noticed Hawk at first. He raised his rifle, finger tightening on the trigger, then stopped. Something felt wrong about ending it this way, with a bullet from the shadows. After everything they'd been through, Kruger deserved to see his death coming. "Kruger," Hawk called, stepping into view with his rifle aimed. Both men whirled. The scarred officer reached for his sidearm, but Kruger raised a hand, stopping him. "Sergeant Hawkins," he greeted as if they were meeting at a diplomatic function. "I wondered when you would find your way to me." "It's over," Hawk stated flatly. "Your men are pinned down. Surrender now, and they live." A thin smile touched Kruger's lips. "A generous offer, but I think not." With startling speed, he drew his pistol and fired, not at Hawk but at the ceiling above him. The ancient timbers collapsed in a shower of debris. Hawk dove forward, narrowly avoiding being crushed. His rifle went skittering across the floor. When he regained his footing, Kruger and his officer were gone, a side door swinging in their wake. Cursing, Hawk drew his pistol and gave chase. The door led to a narrow stairwell ascending to the building's second floor. He took the steps two at a time, ignoring the protest of his wounded shoulder. At the top, he emerged into a long corridor lined with empty rooms. A shot from the far end narrowly missed his head. Hawk flattened against the wall, returning fire. Through a broken window, he could hear the battle intensifying in the courtyard below. "Hawk!" Red's voice crackled over the radio. "They're pushing from the front. Slick's pinned down. Need support." No time for caution. Hawk moved down the corridor at a crouching run, pistol ready. He cleared each room quickly until he reached the final door. It opened onto what had once been an observation deck. Now it served as Kruger's last redoubt. The German commander stood with his back to a partially collapsed railing, pistol aimed steadily at Hawk's chest. His officer was crouched by a window, firing down into the courtyard. "Come no closer, Sergeant," Kruger warned, "or this ends rather anticlimactically for both of us." Hawk held his position, pistol trained on Kruger. A temporary stalemate. "Tell your man to stop firing on my men," Hawk demanded. "Obersturmführer Lehmann follows only my orders," Kruger replied. "And I have ordered him to ensure your friends do not interrupt our final conversation." A shout from below drew Hawk's attention. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of Red staggering backward, blood blossoming across his chest. The Texan dropped to one knee but continued firing, his legendary stubbornness keeping him in the fight despite his mortal wound. Rage surged through Hawk, cold and clarifying. "Call him off," he growled. "Now." "Or what, Sergeant?" Kruger challenged. "You'll shoot me? Then Lehman shoots you. A poor trade for a man of your strategic mind." Before Hawk could respond, Red's voice came through the radio, weak but determined. "Hawk, I've got the bastard in my sights. The one in the window. Say the word." Despite his wound, Red had somehow maneuvered for a clear shot at Lehman. One last act of loyalty from a dying man. "Take it," Hawk ordered without hesitation. A single Shot cracked from below. Lehman jerked backward, a red mist spraying from his throat, then crumpled to the floor. In the same instant, Hawk lunged forward, knocking Kruger's pistol aside as it discharged harmlessly into the wall. The two men crashed to the floor, all pretense of military decorum abandoned in the brutality of close-quarters combat. Kruger was surprisingly strong, his technique refined by years of training. He struck Hawk's wounded shoulder with calculated precision, sending waves of agony through the American's body. Hawk's pistol went sliding across the floor, knocked from his grip. Both men now unarmed, they fought with desperate intensity. Punches, elbows, knees, each seeking the advantage that would mean life over death. Kruger managed to pin Hawk momentarily, hands closing around his throat. "You fought well, Sergeant," he acknowledged, increasing pressure. "But as I told you before, this war favors the ruthless." Hawk's vision began to darken as oxygen deprivation took its toll. With his remaining strength, he drove his knee upward, catching Kruger in the abdomen. The German's grip loosened just enough for Hawk to break free, gasping for air. They separated, struggling to their feet. By unspoken agreement, they reached for their knives simultaneously. Kruger's standard-issue German combat blade, Hawk's Montana hunting knife. The final arbiter of their long contest would be cold steel. "Fitting," Kruger remarked, circling cautiously. Two hunters, ending as nature intended. Predator against predator. Hawk didn't waste breath on words. He feinted left, then slashed right, his blade opening a shallow cut across Kruger's forearm. The German countered with a precise thrust that Hawk barely avoided, the blade slicing through his jacket. They circled again, each taking the measure of the other. Blood loss and exhaustion slowed their movements, turning what might have been an elegant duel into a grim battle of attrition. Hawk could feel his strength ebbing, his wounded shoulder a liability in the close-quarters fight. The next exchange left both men bleeding, Hawk from a gash across his ribs, Kruger from a deep puncture in his thigh. They separated again, breathing heavily. "We are not so different, you and I," Kruger observed, his voice steady despite his wounds. "Both willing to sacrifice everything, even our humanity, for victory." "There's a difference," Hawk countered. "I departed the ruined outpost, leaving Kruger and his men to the mercy of the Ardennes winter." Hawk cast one final glance backward. In the distance, storm clouds gathered once more, promising another blizzard before nightfall. The war, both without and within, continued. They found Ox alive. After burying Red in a shallow grave marked with his rifle and helmet, Hawk and Slick had made the grueling journey back to the forester's cabin. Every step through the deep snow had been a battle against exhaustion and their wounds. They'd moved. In grim silence, each man lost in his own thoughts, the makeshift travois empty now but no lighter for it. Hawk had prepared himself for the worst. He'd rehearsed the words he would say over yet another grave, imagined the weight of one more set of dog tags in his pocket. The big man had been badly wounded, left alone for days in the bitter cold with minimal supplies. The odds of survival had been slim at best. But when they pushed open the cabin door, they found Ox propped against the wall, rifle aimed steadily at the entrance. His face was gray with pain and fever, but his eyes were clear and alert. The massive leg wound had been crudely cauterized, a desperate measure that had likely saved his life, but at terrible cost. "Took you long enough," Ox had rasped, the ghost of a smile touching his lips as he lowered the weapon. "Thought you might have gotten yourselves killed." "Not for lack of trying," Slick had replied, genuine relief cracking through his cynical facade. They'd spent 2 days in the cabin, tending to Ox's wounds and recovering what strength they could. Between them, they pieced together splints and a stretcher from materials scavenged from the cabin. It would be a brutal journey to American lines, carrying Ox's substantial weight through enemy territory. But they would make it. They had to. On the morning of the third day, they'd set out southward, following the path marked on Kruger's captured map. Hawk took point, Slick brought up the rear, and between them they carried Ox on the improvised stretcher. Progress was agonizingly slow, each mile taking hours to cover, each hill a mountain to be conquered. Twice they'd been forced to hide from German patrols, remnants of larger units, disorganized and retreating but still deadly. Hawk had watched them pass from concealment, his hand on his pistol, calculating whether they could be eliminated quietly. Each time he'd decided against it. They were going home. The killing was done, at least for now. On the morning of the 5th day, with their supplies exhausted and Ox slipping in and out of consciousness, they crested a ridge to see American tanks in the valley below, a mechanized column advancing northward as part of the counter-offensive. The sight had nearly brought Slick to tears, though he'd disguised it with a fit of coughing. Now as dawn broke on what Hawk had mentally designated as the first day of after, he stood on another ridge, watching as medics loaded Ox into an ambulance. The big man would live, though the doctors weren't sure if he'd keep the leg. Slick sat nearby on an ammunition crate, a blanket around his shoulders, answering an intelligence officer's questions with uncharacteristic patience. Around them, the American reinforcements moved with practiced efficiency, securing positions, establishing a command post, preparing for the continued push northward. To them, this was just another day in the ongoing offensive. They couldn't see the ghost that Hawk saw, couldn't feel the weight of the invisible dead who crowded around him, demanding to be remembered. Sergeant Hawkins? Hawk turned to find a young lieutenant approaching, clipboard in hand. The officer looked fresh from stateside, his uniform still crisp, his face unmarked by the particular strain that combat etched into a man. "Sir," Hawk acknowledged, instinctively straightening despite the protest of his wounds. "Remarkable operation you conducted," the lieutenant said, consulting his notes. 5 men holding off an entire German battalion for days, eliminating a high-value SS commander, disrupting enemy communications. Command is extremely impressed. Hawk said nothing. There were no words adequate to bridge the gap between this officer's understanding and the reality of what they'd endured. "I've been instructed to inform you that you're being recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross," the lieutenant continued, mistaking Hawk's silence for modesty. "Your men as well. Posthumous awards for the fallen. And you're being granted immediate leave, of course. Medical transport is arranging space for you on the next flight to England once you've been properly treated. Medals, leave. As if these things could possibly matter now. As if anything could balance the scales against what had been lost. The colonel would like your full report when you're up to it," the lieutenant added. "Particularly your assessment of Lieutenant Kruger's tactical approach. Intelligence believes there may be valuable insights." "No," Hawk interrupted, his voice flat. The lieutenant blinked, taken aback. "I'm sorry, Sergeant?" "No report, no medal, no leave." Hawk turned away, looking back toward the north toward the battlefield they'd left behind. "Just get my men home. I understand you've been through an ordeal, Sergeant, but regulations require—" "You don't understand anything." Hawk cut him off. No heat in his voice, only a bone-deep weariness, and neither does command. What happened out there stays out there, buried with the dead. The lieutenant's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Perhaps you should speak with the medical officer, Sergeant. Combat fatigue is nothing to be—" "That'll be all, Lieutenant," came a new voice, deep and authoritative. An older captain had approached without either of them noticing, his weathered face marked with the distinctive lines of a man who had seen too much combat. "I'll take it from here." The lieutenant hesitated, then nodded stiffly and withdrew, casting one last confused glance at Hawk. The captain stood silently for a moment, studying Hawk with eyes that had seen their share of battles. "Walker," he said finally. "Captain?" "James Walker, 10th Armored. I was at Bastogne." Hawk nodded once in acknowledgement, but remained silent. "Your radio man told me some of what happened," Walker continued. "Not everything, I suspect. Some things can't be put into words." He produced a silver flask from inside his jacket and offered it to Hawk. After a moment's hesitation, Hawk accepted, taking a small swallow of whiskey that burned all the way down. He handed it back, and the captain took his own pull before tucking it away. "The brass wants heroes," Walker said, gazing out at the same northern horizon that had captured Hawk's attention. "Stories to tell the folks back home, to print in the papers, narratives that make sense of He gestured vaguely at the war-torn landscape. All this. Hawk understood. The need to impose order on chaos, to find meaning in meaningless suffering. To believe that sacrifice served some greater purpose. But you and I know better, the captain continued. Sometimes there are no clean narratives, no tidy morals to the story. Just men doing what needs to be done, carrying whatever comes after. He reached into his pocket and produced a folded paper, offering it to Hawk. Your orders. Medical discharge if you want it. One signature from the battalion surgeon who happens to owe me a favor, and you're on a transport home. No reports, no debriefs, no medals pinned on by smiling generals. Hawk took the paper, unfolded it, scanned the bureaucratic language that could, with the stroke of a pen, end his war. A way out, a way home, back to Montana, to mountains that had never known artillery fire, streams that ran clear instead of red. Why? He asked finally, looking up at the captain. Walker's eyes held, a shadow of recognition. Because I've seen that look before, in the mirror after my first command, when the living envy the dead because the dead don't have to remember. He nodded toward where Slick sat, still talking with the intelligence officer. Your radio man told me about a letter from the young one who didn't make it, said you promised to deliver it. Hawk's hand moved instinctively to his breast pocket, where Timmy's letter rested alongside Red's dog tags. One final mission. Do that, Walker advised. Then decide. The army will still be here if you want to come back. War isn't going anywhere, never does. With that, he touched his fingers to his helmet in an informal salute and walked away, leaving Hawk alone with the orders and his thoughts. Across the encampment, the medics were finishing their preparations to transport Ox. The big man was awake now, propped up on a stretcher, watching as Hawk approached. His face was still drawn with pain, but his eyes held a clarity that spoke of a corner turned in his fight for survival. You look like hell, Ox observed as Hawk reached him. You're one to talk, Hawk replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. They fell silent, the weight of all that had happened pressing down on them. Finally, Ox spoke again, his voice low so that only Hawk could hear. Was it worth it, Hawk? All of it? The question Hawk had been asking himself since the moment Timmy's voice had gone silent on the radio, since he'd seen Red fall in the courtyard, since he'd plunged his knife into Kruger's chest and felt nothing but emptiness afterward. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe we won't know for years. Maybe never. Ox nodded slowly, accepting this non-answer because there was no better one to give. Slick says you're being offered a ticket home. You too, Hawk told him, nodding at the injured leg. War's over for you one way or another. Yeah. Ox's massive hands fidgeted with the blanket covering him. Don't know what I'll do. Only ever been good at one thing. Hawk understood. The army had shaped them, molded them into weapons. What place was there in peacetime for men such as they had become? A medic approached, informing them that they were ready to move out. Ox reached out, gripping Hawk's arm with surprising strength. Whatever you decide, the big man said, remember you got us through. Against impossible odds, you brought some of us home. Not enough, Hawk replied, the weight of Timmy and Red's absence palpable between them. Never is, Ox acknowledged, but you did what no one else could have. The medics lifted Ox's stretcher, preparing to load him into the waiting ambulance. Hawk watched as they carried his friend away, knowing it might be the last time they saw each other. Another goodbye in a war that had been full of them. He found Slick next, finishing up with the intelligence officer. The radio man looked utterly, spent dark circles under his eyes, his normally sardonic expression replaced by a flat exhaustion. So, Slick said as Hawk approached, these idiots want to give us medals. Apparently, Timmy and Red died for scraps of metal and ribbon. Slick shook his head, his cynicism reasserting itself. Hell of a trade. Hawk said nothing. Slick's bitterness was its own kind of coping mechanism, no better or worse than any other. What's your play? Slick asked, nodding toward the folded orders in Hawk's hand. Taking the golden ticket home? Haven't decided, Hawk admitted. You? Slick shrugged. Not much waiting for me back in Brooklyn. Might as well stay. See this thing through to the end. A shadow crossed his face. Someone ought to be around to remember what they did. Timmy. Red. Yeah. Hawk agreed quietly. The burden of memory. The obligation of the survivor. A jeep pulled up nearby, the driver calling out that transport was ready for those heading to the field hospital. Slick rose wearily, gathering his few possessions. If you're heading stateside, he said, look up Timmy's folks after you deliver that letter, and Red's. Tell them. He trailed off, then shook his head. Hell, I don't know what you'd tell them. That it mattered, maybe, even if we're not sure it did. He extended his hand, and Hawk grasped it firmly. Another goodbye that might be final. Stay frosty, Hawk, Slick said with a shadow of his old self. Try not to get too soft back in civilization. Then he was gone, limping toward the waiting jeep. A solitary figure diminished by all they had lost, but somehow still standing. Hawk found himself alone again. The bustle of the military encampment flowing around him like water around a stone. Officers shouted orders. Vehicles rumbled past. Soldiers prepared for the next phase of the offensive. The machinery of war ground on, indifferent to individual grief or doubt. He walked to the edge of the camp, looking northward one last time. Somewhere out there lay the battlefield they had created, already being reclaimed by winter's snow. Timmy's grave beneath the avalanche. Red's shallow resting place marked with a rifle that would soon be buried or scavenged. The abandoned outpost, where Kruger lay impaled, a worthy adversary in death as in life. So much death. And for what? Territory that would change hands again in the next offensive? Principles that politicians would compromise at the peace table? Glory that existed only in newspaper headlines and not in the mud and blood of reality. Hawk's fingers found the metal dog tags around his neck, his identity reduced to stamped letters and numbers. With a single sharp tug, he broke the chain, holding the tags in his palm for a long moment before placing them on a nearby rock. Whoever he had been when those were issued no longer existed. That man had died somewhere in the Ardennes, alongside the men he'd led and the enemy he'd faced. He turned southward, toward the distant roads that would eventually lead to England, to America, to Montana. He had a letter to deliver, promises to keep. After that, who could say? The future stretched before him, as unmarked as new-fallen snow. As he began walking, a light snow started to fall, tiny crystalline flakes swirling in the air like the fragments of all that had been shattered over these past days. Above, the clouds gathered, thick and dark. Another storm approaching, another trial to be endured. But he had faced the firestorm and emerged, scorched but not consumed. Whatever came next, he would face that too, carrying with him the lessons learned in blood and the memories of those who had stood against the darkness at his side. Behind him, the sounds of the encampment faded. Before him, the road disappeared, into a thickening curtain of white. Like his future, uncertain but inescapable. One step at a time. 1 mile, 1 day, 1 breath in the frozen air. The war, both without and within, continued. But so did he. Up next we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.